webinar.
Mike, the name of your organization again, so I get it correct?
Where Peter is. Just the website, wherepeteris.com.
Yeah.
And we are now streaming live on YouTube, so I'll invite folks to mute themselves. Peter, I think we should start letting the audience in.
Good afternoon, welcome. Glad that you are joining us in our discussion this afternoon. We're going to wait a couple minutes more to allow everyone to join in. So a minute or two more, please. Well, again, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar sponsored by the Catholic Common Ground Initiative. We have the privilege of being housed and supported at the Bernardine Center of the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. And we express our gratitude to Professor Steve Millies and his colleagues for making this time together possible. I'm going to ask each of my colleagues to introduce themselves. I'll go around because I've discovered over the years what I think is interesting to describe about another person is not necessarily what they think is interesting. So we'll start with Sister Doris Gottemuller, who has been with the Common Ground Initiative from its very beginning. Sister.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am a Sister of Mercy. I reside in Cincinnati. My ministry experiences encompass teaching, healthcare administration, mission work, community administration, and now I'm kind of semi-retired, but I'm doing trustee work for our health system. So.
Very good. Thank you, Sister. Nicole?
Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Flores, and I am Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. Prior to coming here, I finished my PhD at Boston College, lest you think that I have no connection to Catholic institutions. And I'm originally from Denver, Colorado, but I've lived in Virginia for a while. Before that, I lived in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, all over New England. So I'm very delighted to be connected to the CCGI on a national level, because I feel like so much of my own experience of the faith has been across regions and across different pockets of cultures and people and groups within the church. So it's a real delight to be here today for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. And Mike Lewis, who is new to Catholic Common Ground.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Lewis. I am the editor-in-chief of the website wherepeteris.com. It's basically a journal or a periodical that expresses Catholic thought and promotes the mission and vision of Pope Francis. Prior to that, I was the director of operations at Catholic Climate Covenant. And prior to that, I spent 7 years in the communications office at the US CCB. So longtime church bureaucrat, I guess you could say. But absolutely glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I look forward to the conversation. And I'm coming to you from Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. As I said, I'm Father Michael Place. I'm priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago. I did my degree at doctoral degree at Catholic University of America. I was in seminary faculty and administration, and then 14 years with Cardinal Bernardine as theologian to the Cardinal and to the Curia, which is how I became involved in Catholic Common Ground and at its very beginning. Then the rest of my ministry has been focused in Catholic healthcare as president of the Catholic Health Association, and now serving Franciscan Alliance as its chief ethics officer. So we are so glad all of you are joining us to be part of this conversation. We invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to type in your questions. We will break at certain points in the conversation to engage the questions and have an opportunity then for you to be in dialogue with our conversation. So we are gathered to talk about a papal encyclical. I had read it when it first came out, and to be honest, I sped read it to try and get the high level, and so I could look like I read it. And a couple of days ago, I actually sat down and read it. And it is, from my perspective, an easy read, but a lot to read. So I thought we would begin the conversation by asking each of our panelists, what are the 2 or 3 most significant or salient, striking takeaways which they have after they have read the encyclical? So Mike, why don't we start with you?
Let me unmute myself. Sure, yeah. So like you, actually, I sped read it initially because I hosted a live event with 8 participants, including Steve Millies. So this is a payback on his end. So this week I actually sat down and gave it a very close reading. There are the 3 things that jumped out at me, especially with respect to this conversation, were the global vision that Pope Francis projects. Very clear that it should be respectful of all people in their uniqueness, their diversity, their cultural identity, as opposed to a uniform view that has to be imposed on everybody else. Another thing that really struck me, because this is something that I think in our culture we've been really trying to figure out what to do, is how people with great differences can begin to have a dialogue. Should we set aside those differences and ignore them? Should we be cognizant of them? And I think Pope Francis gives a really wise perspective of how we should approach dialogue, where we're cognizant of each other's differences and we don't hide them, but we start from places of agreement and common ground. And the third thing is in his discussion of social programs and his economic vision. He is very clear in his opposition to ideologies that it shouldn't be the powerful or the wealthy who are listened to and who make the decisions and then who impose programs on others, but that everyone from wherever they are in society should have a voice in both the decision making, in making needs known, and then in carrying out whatever program will assist the people.
Thank you. Nicole.
Yes, I did some kind of combination of speed reading it and trying to read it in depth the first time through, but I find as I continue to reflect on the document, that a couple of themes continue to stand out regardless of my pace or intentionality of reading. The one that really caught me first and foremost was the invitation right off the bat in number 8, let us dream together. That there's something about this document, and I think, you know, it is completely appropriate that we'll discuss, you know, some of the significance for politics and for policy and how we structure those political aspects of our lives. But on a certain level, for me, I was really captured by this imaginative, almost playful invitation to enter into reflection together, and how that reflects the now how many years is that, you know, since 2013, the forming Franciscan corpus of works. So many of them have this aesthetic dimension to them, where we're asked to imagine or to see something in a new way. And I think that that method of inviting us to engage our senses is really crucial to what he's proposing for the common good and proposing for our faith. And I think that takes me to the second point that really stands out to me is the kind of an echoed emphasis that Francis places on seeing, and seeing as an act of faith. So if you will recall from Lumen Fidei, he talks about seeing, faith being an act of seeing with the eyes of Christ. And that's what really stuck with me from that document and has entered into my daily practice of faith. How, with what eyes am I seeing? Am I trying to see with the eyes of Christ? And if I am, what am I seeing? And I think that Francis does a great job of opening our eyes and inviting us to see those who suffer and making an essential connection between that recognition of suffering and seeing it with our own eyes and experiencing it with our own senses, and then taking the next step towards a concrete solidarity. But we can't have that solidarity without the recognition. So that really stood out to me. And the third point, and this will stand out to me as the granddaughter of immigrants, is the place that Francis has that Francis puts on immigrants, on those who suffer at the borders, and how he uses the context, our global context and our current moment in the world where we've seen so much suffering among immigrant communities. But then he extends that out and looks at how COVID-19 has affected particular communities in just really dramatic ways, and invites us to extend our view beyond just, you know, fighting over who should be, you know, the president of the United States, or, you know, who should be on the Supreme Court, and says there's real suffering people whose lives are at stake within these structures. So while those fights, I would never say that they're unimportant, and I don't think that Francis is saying that at all. I think his grounding his reflection in the lives of those who are vulnerable and those who are suffering really captures me about this document and is crucial to interpreting it.
Thank you. Mr. Doris.
I was certainly struck by the same points that Nicole and Mike were, but I would also say that I was struck by the fact that Francis effectively expands the Catholic common ground idea of dialogue from intra-church to global. Mm. And that is a huge a huge expansion, because the initiative began some 25 years ago with an attempt to counter the lack of dialogue and mutual understanding and respect within the church. And now he's taken it from there to a global stage. And, I could expand on that. He also roots what he has to say in the twin pillars of human dignity and the common good. And I think those are two phrases that we hear so often. We say, oh, yes, human dignity, common good. That's what Catholic social teaching is all about. But to delve down into them, what is human dignity? There aren't enough books to express the source and the meaning of human dignity and the common good. The common good, who's good? My good, your good, the people I love, the people I care for, the people who look like me, everybody, the common good on a global scale. And then third, he towards the end, he enumerates rather effectively, I think, some of the obstacles to dialogue. It's as if he attended a Catholic Common Ground meeting. And he said, well, look, folks, this is all well and good. I know you mean well, but you have to understand what some of the obstacles are to dialogue today, especially on a global scale. When others' viewpoints are ridiculed and subjected to relentless suspicion and denigration and criticism, invalidates their right to have an opinion. He also uses a phrase that I noted, reductive anthropological visions.
It's a real easy one to get your hands around.
That's right. Sounds like an answer to Jeopardy or something. Reductive anthropological vision, whereby some opinions and participations are worth more than others or less than others. If the speaker looks like me, belongs to the same church I do, comes from the same country, it belongs to the same economic group, then probably they know more. They might even know as much as I do. And their opinion is worth more. But if they fail any of those tests, well, I can somewhat dismiss what they have to say or qualify it. And another obstacle to dialogue, he mentions, is the exclusion and mistreatment of women and their exclusion from public life. He said, we're still far from granting women the same dignity and right as we claim. We say often women have equal rights, but actually practicing it is something else. And it's interesting to note, a number of readers have pointed out that of all the hundreds of quotations in this document, not one is from a woman. So we all have a lot to learn because there's wisdom that's neglected there, even in this wonderful document. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to pick up on one of Nicole's points, and it's probably because it engages some work I did years ago, and that is on the role and power of imagination. I think in Catholic intellectual circles are in many ways a continuing product of the Enlightenment. And I think therefore I am. And dialogue is a verbal process, or could be seen only as a verbal process. But in the image of encounter, which is, I think in the document, foundational to dialogue, that encounter is certainly much more than a linear verbal reality. And so I'm wondering how we will bring that insight of the power and importance of imagination, which it also connects to his embrace of diversity of culture, because the non-Western cultures in many ways still have that dynamic of the imagination, of the non-rational, of the affective modalities of communication as part of their experience. So the question which I'm throwing back for our conversation is, does the document invite us to a richer understanding of dialogue than common sense use of the word would suggest? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can take a first crack at it. I love this this dynamic that you're highlighting between dialogue and perhaps aspects of our human identity and human experience that aren't exactly logical or rational in all cases. And I do think that the language of encounter broadens the invitation for dialogue, which is clearly there. And but I do think that the way we're invited to engage in it is one, and especially within the context, the multicultural global context that the document highlights, is one of encounter with our, pardon my Jesuit roots here for a second, with whole persons, with our entire selves. And that even our ability to think and to reason and to make arguments is deeply influenced by our capacity to imagine. And in this time of teaching online, I've found that so much of my work in trying to reach students, because I can't be with them in the same room, has become more difficult. So I'm finding myself turning to journaling exercises and drawing, can you draw at least for yourself, an image of what you believe we're talking about, or having that kind of stimulation for our minds is just as important as learning to craft a persuasive argument and to write well. And I do think that you're right, Father Place, that some of this influence and this push to, or maybe a nudge, less a push, more of a nudge from Pope Francis, is to reimagine dialogue in ways that incorporates our emotions in ways that we might not necessarily acknowledge. When we're discussing a difficult or neuralgic issue, do we consult, how am I feeling? How does this make me feel when I talk about a disagreement around, the place of women in the church? Does that make me angry? Does it make me sad? Does it, make me uncomfortable? And naming that, I think, is a part of a dialogue that is helpful for going deeper than just our rational arguments can. Although I would never, argue to forego that kind of argumentation. But those are my initial thoughts on that.
Right.
Thank you. I want to hear from others, but I want to remind our participants, other participants, that if you have a question, please type it in, and we will get to them, the first round of them, in a few minutes. Any other comments on it? Yes, Sister Doris.
I'd like to reflect on what Nicole just said, and also what she said earlier about seeing. And so I'd like to share a little scenario that I've often imagined in the last several years, if you'll permit me. It involves our president, the US president, sitting across the table from another man of the same age, approximately the same age, with several grown children, who works in a factory job. Two are across from each other. They're dressed alike. in nondescript shirts and pants, no jewelry or sign of wealth. And their discussion, their dialogue goes along the following lines. What do we share in common? What do we share in common? Secondly, what have been the causes of joy in your life? And what were the experiences of pain and sorrow? What do you ask of me? What do you ask of me? And what do you live for? What are you willing to die for? Can you hear that dialogue between the two? In short, they've made themselves vulnerable to one another. And you can change the persons at the table in a lot of ways. The corporate owner of a fruit company and a fruit picker, or a US soldier deployed in Afghanistan and a member of ISIS, or a bishop and a new convert. The point is that the imbalance of power gives way to a mutual recognition of the inherent human dignity of the other. And I think we need to, if we want to understand and facilitate and promote dialogue, create situations where we make ourselves vulnerable to one another, where we can say to one another, what do you live for? And what are you willing to die for? And boy, that wipes away a lot of stuff, a lot of paraphernalia that we may have been relying on.
Oh,
Thank
well,
you.
thank you. Both of you hit on different topics. So, but the same theme. Nicole talked about the nudge, I guess, what Francis is trying to nudge us towards, and I've felt that nudge. I've felt that invitation, and in my own work and experience, I've noticed that others have been resistant, maybe, to that invitation. And one of the, I don't know if he uses it in this particular encyclical, but he says it all the time. He says realities are greater than ideas. But the ironic thing is he's also inviting us to dream and to use our imagination. So how do we tie the dream and the imagination to the ideas? And I think with the ideas, the thought of those ideas is when we think about things abstractly, like this is the best thing for everybody. This is the best thing for society. This is what everyone needs to do. But when we use our imagination, just like Sister Doris said, when we think about concrete situations in the world, people who have found themselves, people who are poor, people who have gone through tragedy, people who have gone through job loss, people who are estranged from loved ones, or who, whatever these realities are, who've been affected by the climate or by war, that's where he invites us to use our imaginations and to dream in relation to these realities. And unlike some of you, I don't have Jesuit formation. So I like read these things that he writes, and they're like, oh yeah, that's because he's a Latin American Jesuit. And it's like, oh, okay. I need to meet more Latin American Jesuits. I went to a Xavier and Brothers high school, but they're kind of, the redheaded stepchildren of the Jesuits. Nothing against redheads, and we should listen to their experience as well. But yeah, no, I'm fascinated by the way that he brings us. It's like he's directing us. He's not giving us an overview, but it's like, consider this, consider that, recognize this in the person, think about that in the person. What's their experience? And I think in terms of common ground, it's, if we start on those levels, okay, maybe this person has reactionary impulses, or is angered by certain things or has formed a worldview that's a certain way. It's like, okay, but we have to find that beginning spot, where do you care about your children? Do you care about eating? Okay, we both care about these issues. Now let's progress in dialogue. If that kind of ties those two concepts together. But it's just interesting how he talks about realities, and then the next thing he does is he talks about dream. But I think what he's asking us is, there are no one size fits all solutions, and there are unique aspects to each of us that must be respected, that are good, that should be lifted up, that we should recognize and praise in one another, and they glorify God. And but you can't write a simple rule book about that, or a one size fits all solution. You've got to apply these Christian principles, and then, or you've got to start with these principles, but then apply them to the realities.
Where does that take us then? When thinking about dialogue as a vehicle? I mean, this is another way of engaging what we've been talking about, but flipping it a bit, that we tend, I think, to devolve into dialogue as a thing, something you do. And I think he is proposing a much richer understanding of dialogue as a way of encounter, which picks up on what Doris was talking about, that unless you get to vulnerability, you really have only encountered part of the person, the appearances, the modalities of power that are either implicit or explicit. So how would we help, the thinking in terms of the original take on common ground as interecclesial? How do you invite folks within the church to think of dialogue in this richer sense, not as a thing that's done? And then after we have this little conversation about that, then we have a couple questions we're going to take.
I like to think of, am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah.
I like to think of this encyclical as sort of completing an arc that began with the social encyclicals in the late 19th century and dealt with the relationship of nations and persons and groups like unions and workers and so on. And finally, Francis brings it down to the individual, myself and my neighbor. And the Good Samaritan never asks the wounded traveler for his union card or his passport or anything, just you are my neighbor. And so to begin in a parish, in a diocese, to see one another in that community as all seekers, as all loved of God, as all equal in human dignity, I think that's the call we have to give, the call we have to make. And then we can lay aside some of the trappings that make us unequal or different and recognize that we are all brothers and sisters, all striving for the same goals, all vulnerable to one another.
Well, Doris, that's his social friendship.
Social friendship, right? Exactly.
Which I really, first time I read the phrase, I'm like, what is that?
Right.
And I got through the first part of the encyclical and it was there, and then it comes back towards the end. And it's like he teased the concept and then inductively carries you through a set of experiences and then comes back and it's like, oh, that's what he was talking about. I mean, he's a fabulous teacher in that sense.
Yeah.
Mike, you talked about pointing, sort of teasing us, inviting us. And, other thoughts on that? How do we extend this broader, richer sense of dialogue into the church community?
I mean, the short answer is I don't quite know. We have to keep praying about it, but because I think your point, Father Place, of the way that dialogue is treated as a thing, if it's treated at all right now, I imagine some of the rest of you share a bit of sadness and lament with me that as Catholics, we even after so many decades of this work, there's so much animosity, and it only seems to be exacerbated in the social, social media world. Although there are moments of hope, there are rays of hope there. I don't want to be too dour, but it feels like we've worked very hard on this, and yet we still objectify dialogue as this, as this thing. And there was a piece on, as a part of a Commonweal symposium on Fratelli Tutti by a theologian named Naomi Deanda, and she actually kind of presses on Pope Francis and says, actually, dialogue is not, and I guess also on us as an organization committed to dialogue, dialogue itself can be hard. It's not all it's cracked up to be. It can be harmful if, and she doesn't just say any old dialogue, but she says if we don't attend to the power structures that that can be present in these kinds of conversations, that there are people who within the dialogue she has in mind, people who set the agenda and people with more power in a room than other people. And even in your wonderful example, Sister Doris, I think of especially the example of the fruit company owner and the farm worker. When I was younger, I worked, I was a summer intern with an organization that supported the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who of course they organize for justice in the tomato fields in Southwest Florida. And a lot of their work is showing up, trying to persuade food company owners to sit down and to literally just come to the table with them and reach an agreement and have a dialogue. And a lot of their work is simply standing outside of these organizations, of these corporations, and being ignored or mocked, and that power dynamic won't even allow them to come into a dialogue that would help. So they organize to just bring those organizations to the table. It's a very simple mission that they've had over the course of their own several decades long history now. But I wonder if this language of encounter demands more from a dialogue than just being an object, that it's just something that can easily happen, that it can happen one time and that can, fix something. That the encounter aspect of that, I think really, it suggests the kind of long-term relationships that I think CCGI has been committed to. I was, before everyone came onto the call, I was lamenting missing my annual fall trip to Hyde Park to see everyone on the advisory committee. And a part of that is, I just love Chicago in autumn, but a part of that is because those relationships, those embodied encounters, those, sitting around and sharing a meal together and discussing where we are in our lives and what's important to us, what matters to us, what are the challenges that face us as Catholics, both intra-church but also outward looking. I think that is the lifeblood of a living dialogue. There's a dialogue that can be drained and and dry and all but dead, and a dialogue that can be vibrant. And a part of that vibrant dialogue requires those that personal interaction with people that goes beyond just knowing what's your religion, what part of what Catholic team are you on, what's your political party, what's your race, what's your gender, and that our hopes and dreams and our desires for the world and our desires to be disciples to Jesus Christ are so much more complex than just those categories that get all of the airtime.
If I could jump in again,
Yes.
I think what you've just described, Nicole, is vulnerability, making ourselves vulnerable to one another. And if I could give a historical note, the origins of the Catholic Common Ground Initiative began that way, with a group of lay and religious, clerical and Episcopal friends, 20 or 25, meeting a couple times a year for a weekend for just that kind of sharing. Sharing a meal together, sharing prayer together, sharing our hopes, our disappointments, our problems. And we made ourselves vulnerable to one another. It was very confidential, but then our desire was to extend that experience to the wider church. But as you know, that's still a long way from happening. And then I hear Francis saying, well, let's extend it globally. Oh, really? And an experience of trust, of vulnerability, where each has something to lose, and each has something to gain, but we wish the good of the other. I don't wish to beat him. I don't wish to win. I wish the good of the other. That's such a gospel value, but very hard to achieve.
And Doris, one of our participants has posed the question, picking up on that, how different is Francis's vision from Cardinal Bernardine's and CCGI. And I think you, laying out the origin, described that in many ways they are compatible.
Yes, yeah. It's just that Francis has expanded it.
Yes, yes. And as I reflect on our journey with the Common Ground Initiative, our 10th anniversary statement, which Doris, you recall, we really worked on, it came to the conclusion, one of its conclusions, reflecting on where we'd been and the question before us was, do we go forward? Or, is it time for a sunset? And to my mind, one of the most important conclusions was that common ground is not, and dialogue is not a thing, but a spirituality. And it's how you see the other that makes dialogue possible. And that's what your example and this comment right now, Doris, that's what you've been pointing out so beautifully. Mike, did you have something?
Yeah, just as someone who worked for the church for a long time, and I've been Catholic my whole life. What both Doris and Nicole are talking about with regards to power structures. If when I become cynical about Pope Francis's message, which I try not to do, but when I do, it's okay. Well, this synodality, dialogue, inclusion, great concepts, but is he talking about ideas or realities? Because it seems to me that a lot of times when there is that power imbalance, unless that vulnerability and that openness is present, And if the person, and it, you know, it would take the effort of that person in power to consciously decide that I'm going to open this up. I'm going to invite this person into dialogue, that I have, you know, full power to just say, I want to ignore this person, or I don't want to listen to this person, whether it's a woman, whether it's another lay person, whether it's someone that they from another faith, or that they have an ideological disagreement with. And I think that's what Francis is nudging. But it's like one of those things, you look at these synodal processes that are going on in different countries around the world, or the synods of bishops, and it's sort of like, well, the people are there are the ones who were picked. And I think Francis maybe has been conscious about bringing in different perspectives, but it's, it really is a holistic change. It's a conversion that needs to take place, and a real openness and a real vulnerability and a real conscious effort to, who am I missing? What perspectives am I not considering? Who have I dismissed out of hand that really deserves a hearing? But then again, you bring up social media and this polarization, and it's like, do we want to invite hostility? I mean, there are a lot of considerations that go into it, but I definitely think that a dialogue it's an ongoing spiritual approach that can't go away.
Well, picking up on that, I'd like to turn our attention to his section on the dark clouds. That was his part 2. And he addresses what he speaks of as the illusions of communication.
Mm.
And we in Common Ground have, for a couple of years now, have been trying to get inside the question of what is the role of dialogue in terms of social media. And this, especially paragraphs 43 and 50, I mean, if you take those by themselves, it would be, there'd be a new commandment: thou shalt not Twitter. And woe are those who are on Facebook. So what do we think of, in light of his critique, what is the role of dialogue within the church, or the possibilities of dialogue within the church, in and through different forms of communication, which are, for many folks today, you know, the iPhone and immediate communication in short blasts is the state of play. So how does that insight in that section of his dark clouds, the illusion of communication, speak to Catholic Common Ground and building dialogue going forward?
Well, I think as the one of the resident millennials among us, an old millennial, a grandma millennial, but a millennial nonetheless. This conversation really resonates.
Excuse me, Nicole, if you're the grandmother millennial, I don't know where that puts Doris and myself, but I'm just leaving that behind.
Well, my students, they are always shocked when I tell them how old I am these days. But in any case, that, you know, these ways of communicating came on the scene when I was in high school, and they really did shift something for my part of the generation. They really did. We went from, you know, using landlines to call each other and doing, you know, multiple lines, calling into, you know, a brief period where we all had beepers, which was odd, but perhaps historically unremarkable, but a little quirky, to this explosion of social media in platforms that seem like dinosaurs now, but even if you look back, they were the beginnings of the kind of the forms of communication that we have now. And I think the comments Father placed about dialogue as a spirituality is something that is so crucial right now. I thought about this a lot, and I do think about this a lot, both during the election and its aftermath, because I think that cancel culture has had a lot of, airtime on various media outlets, but I think beyond just the politicization of, whether or not someone should, stop communicating with another person, which, coming from the perspective of someone who thinks some rights and advocates for those who've been sexually abused. There, of course, are good reasons to not be in relationship with someone anymore. But the reasons that are often given in these social media spaces aren't anything like that. You said something I didn't like, and so I'm going to block you. There's a way to literally stop listening to someone and for them to stop seeing what you're saying. And it's so the severing of that connection is so easy. And it's so tempting when someone says something, oh, I can't believe they said that, to not take advantage of those quick, convenient means of ending a friendship or ending a relationship. And this is not just average people out in the world. This is theologians. These are, people who work in and with the church who are doing these things. So that spirituality and remembering that the work that we do as people who are either pastoring God's church or pursuing truth in theology, that we have an outsized responsibility to model the spirituality, and that all of us, regardless of our vocations or of our specific place in life, have a call to do this as well. That it takes the discipline of being mindful in these social spaces of the danger of saying, I'm just going to block you because I don't like what you're saying. I don't agree with it. Or deciding to, lambast someone just because, it's convenient and everyone else is doing it. So there's a fine balance, I think, between, saying things that are critical but need to be said, and the growing trend I'm seeing of people just readily and willfully ending relationship because it's the easy thing to do. And that's just a concern that I have in relation to dialogue.
Mhm.
Well, in a sense, it's an act of violence. Blocking can be an act of violence.
Mhm.
Mike is someone who has got a presence in this world of perniciousness. What do you think of the Pope's critique?
Every time he brings up social media, I do an examination of conscience because I worry. I think one thing that we have to acknowledge, however, is that these are modern contemporary forms of communication and of network building. They are, in and of themselves, they don't, there's not really a moral value to them. But because of the type of, the newness of the type of communication, they present specific challenges and dangers and pitfalls that any of us can fall into. When somebody, like, for example, I was really civil early on in my social media days, but then, once my audience grew bigger and bigger and bigger, and I started getting, for lack of a better word, haters, people who specifically, and they start targeting in personal ways, and there's that temptation to lash back. I think that it's important for Catholics and all people, and for people of goodwill, if their temperament is up to it, or if they're up to the challenge to be present in these spaces. Because if you leave them to toxicity, or just to the toxic elements and toxic people, they're not going to go away. Those spaces, they're just not. They're going to have fewer voices of reason and of with goodwill and respect for human dignity in mind. I mean, everything that he says in terms of how it is, it doesn't meet the level of an in-person conversation. I mean, I'd love to be sitting across the table from the three of you having a conversation. Instead, we're spread around the country. So I think we need to keep in mind the types of toxicity, the cancel culture, the blocking, verbal abuse. Ridicule is so easy just to pile on, or somebody ridicules somebody else and you can just hit that like button and you've become a participant in that ridicule. And they talk about the psychological effects. Is this addictive? Which it is, I think. They say that every time you get a like or a response or a retweet, there's a little dopamine blast that you get. So it can feed your ego, and I think it might drive people to become more extreme or more outrageous. But yeah, I mean, the critique is absolutely sound, because it's not a replacement for older forms of communication, but writing a letter isn't a replacement for having dinner with somebody. I mean, that's just a fact of the matter, or a phone call. So, I mean, maybe there's a little bit of, because Pope Francis loves getting on the phone. You hear these stories about him just, getting somebody's number and calling back 3 times until they finally answer. And that was his generation's mass social media communication. So there might be a little generational thing in there, but he is very right about the dangers and the challenges.
I'd like to add one more thought to the idea of the importance of digital communication. One is that it has created a borderless world. It doesn't take any longer to send a message to someone in Sydney, Australia than it does in the office down the hall. It's perhaps in milliseconds there's a difference, but who can tell? So in a borderless world, the possibilities for dialogue and the necessity of it are accented, to go to the point of his encyclical. And at one point he says that government identities and relationships have diminished in value, and they've been overtaken by financial relationships and market relationships. And, so governments are less significant today than they were, maybe a generation or two ago, because communication spans and overtakes and exceeds anything a government can say. Something to be reckoned with.
Yes. I remember this is years ago, in Jerusalem, when the fall of communism was unfolding, and there was a broadcast from Moscow, and so it was, I'm in Jerusalem. It's going from Moscow to Atlanta to Jerusalem, and it struck me, we're in a new era.
Yes.
It'll never be the same, because all 3 of these cities that we would think are totally separated are now instantaneously united.
That's right.
And
whatever their governments are.
yes,
it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Right. I'd like to turn us a little bit in the questions that have come in. There's been some energy around the power imbalance in the church. And so if we are in Francis's vision, we have social friendship in terms of global, well, within the koinonia that is the church, there's a bond of friendship. And so if we take all the images of Francis and of encounter, of listening, of walking together, how do we square all of that with the reality that our ecclesial, political, social structure, like every social reality, has a power imbalance? He's attempting, in one sense, the synodality is a way to expand that frame, but what is the role of ecclesial dialogue? So I'll frame the question. The role of ecclesial dialogue that Common Ground envisions with the reality of power imbalance. That's what folks are asking. And Doris, you're chuckling, and so you'll answer.
I was going to say, let me know when you have it figured out. And so one little cynical thought I had is that power imbalance may destroy itself as we see some of the things exposed publicly that would have been swept under the rug generations ago. And so there is a way in which there's some self-destructive potential there. And God willing, it'll open up to something new. That's my thought.
Other thoughts?
I think that one crucial aspect of dialogue, and I know that that at least in my work on the committee, everybody has been very aware of this. So this isn't a direct critique, particularly of our work, but I think it is an important one to keep in mind when thinking about power dynamics within the church. Is it gets back to Professor Deanda's point that I quoted earlier. Dialogue can be harmful, but how does that change when we think about who's coming into a conversation, and what kind of authority are we giving to those who do enter into the room? So I think this is a roundabout way of me gesturing to the preferential option. Are we inviting in those who have been left out of previous dialogues? Or in, when we think about the impasses that we have, when we think about generations long disputes within our church about particular issues, but those arguments have been had among those who have power, or who have access to these conversations, or if we're discussing racism and white supremacy without Black Catholics in the room, are we really discussing it? So attending very carefully to who we invite in, I think is so important. While I would also not want to forego the intentionality around bringing groups together. I think one thing that strikes me is that it's getting harder and harder to find those who are committed to having dialogues, even within the church. This is left, right, and center. This is not on any particular one group withholding from the other. It's a lot of withholding from each other, that it is getting harder to do that, but that we might find more willing conversation partners if we invite in new people, and we allow the people who are coming in to tell us what's, as Sister Doris has said, what's important to them, and what issue, maybe the most important issue to Black Catholics is not the issue that's been the most important one for previous generations of primarily white Catholics who've been involved in dialogues historically. But I say this again, aware that the work of our particular group has been very mindful of this, and I look forward to seeing that continue to blossom, because it's a spirituality, and it's a habit. It's a virtue, and we have to practice if that's something we want to become as the CCGI.
I think putting those two together, that mindfulness that Nicole talked about, and as Sister Doris was saying, the fact that things are being exposed that weren't exposed, that would have been swept under the rug in the past. And I think that that's a benefit, or that's maybe a plus of modern communication. We look at 2002, and it took the secular press. Within the church, very little could be done because things were swept under the rug, but because of the newspaper, because of the internet, which was just starting out at the time, having a secretive or power imbalance type of system, and the word clericalism gets thrown around, I think, aptly to describe this, it's just not going to work. It's going to unravel if you try to hold everything in. And I think our leaders, and I think this is what Francis is asking, are those who do hold the power to do, is not to expect the old system to work anymore, or it's going to backfire on you big time. And I think our role as people within the church, because we have these communications tools that we didn't have before, because we have access to people all around the world, is to be mindful and to take notice of things and to bring them up with people who maybe have overlooked them. I've interacted with a couple of diocesan bishops in the last year or so, where there were scandalous things going on in their dioceses. And in one case, it was like a priest who had a website that was like, holy cow, this guy is like this there's something going on. And came to find out that the bishop had no clue. Yet this priest had thousands of readers. So I think we can't take for granted, especially because of a generational difference, that that the people in leadership are aware, but they also need to be brought into this conversation, like, hey, things aren't working, and this is why, and use the means at our disposal. And I'm not saying we should dig up dirt on people, or I mean, the mindset's not ratting each other out, but it's like, hey, there's a group here that's being marginalized that you should be aware of. And these are the people that you need to be in contact with. Here, I'll make that connection. I mean, I love networking people together, like, oh, you're from, Iowa. Did you know this guy's from Iowa too? And then they become best friends. But I mean, that's just a particular, maybe that's particular to me, maybe that, but trying to help build that transparency that's going to happen regardless, because if it doesn't, the church is just going to collapse in on itself. It's going to become self-referential. It's going to become out of touch with the world, with reality. And I don't think anybody wants that. But there's going to be a lot of pain, I think, in the process of working towards that open church that really does listen to everybody.
Thank you. We began this segment looking at the power imbalance, and I'm going to try and not summarize it, but pull it together with an observation that for the common ground experience, one of the keys to a successful dialogue has been creating a sense of safe harbor, that one is free to be oneself, and that one will therefore, and in an environment where one will be respected being oneself, and to express perspectives that another in the room might not agree with. And to create that sense of safe harbor, my experience has been it's kicked off by quality prayer and taking the time collectively, the group coming to dialogue, starting grounded in prayer, because then we're grounded in the Lord, in the more. We have, over the years, had dialogues on various topics, and one time, this is maybe 20 years ago, Doris would remember, the question was, could we have a dialogue about the issues around human sexuality? And there was grave concern that it could become, by doing it, it could become politicized, et cetera, et cetera. So the agreement was it was going to be one of those events that didn't happen. So it was married couples and bishops. Folks from not as much of the continuum as is today, but gay folks. And what happened was what Doris pointed out early on, is because it was grounded in prayer, because people came with a commitment to being there, there was a vulnerability that allowed a level of communication that, if it were recorded, would be completely misunderstood if you just looked at the words. And that's why to do dialogue is it's hard work, and I think we have to think about the spaces in which we do it, and the ways in which we invite ourselves as an ecclesial reality, as a graced reality, to pursue it. So with that, I want to move to our final section, which, believe it or not, is the title. What does the Pope's reflections say to the Catholic Common Ground Initiative? And I want to focus that with a little prelude that Francis clearly believes that there is an objective reality someplace. There is it doesn't have to be truth in the Kantian or Cartesian sense of truth, but there is the reality of God's activity and giftedness and as expressed in God's creation. So it's because he trusts in that he says dialogue is not about compromise, which takes us back to the origin of the Common Ground Initiative, where we were accused of seeking to compromise truth. That if you have dialogue, that means you're compromising truth. And Francis is very clear that dialogue is not about compromise, but about finding a higher truth or a higher awareness. So in that frame of Francis seeing the result or the goal of common ground dialogue that seeks common ground, going to a higher spot, what does the encyclical say to Catholic Common Ground Initiative?
Well, in some ways, it's an encouragement to soldier on, keep trying. And, we never exactly see the fruit of what we do. We may go home after one of our weekends or meetings and think, well, what was that worth, and what have we planted in people's hearts and in their minds? And then the publication comes out, and who sees that? So it's, it's in some ways persevering, says a lot. But also what I hear in an encyclical is to expand our range of topics from only intra-ecclesial to a wider range of topics. Now, in some ways, anything that involves human well-being is ecclesial, if you look at the church in one way.
Right.
But perhaps we could challenge ourselves to cast a little wider net, including some of the people we invite to participate in the dialogues.
Yes. So that is, as those on the committee know, the greatest challenge to Common Ground Initiative, Nicole talked about it earlier, is finding folks who want a dialogue, who disagree.
Yes, yes, yes.
And maybe at least in the American culture, if there is a pause in the political rhetoric going forward to a different level, we might find a little more space, but that's a little editorial side push. Nicole, you were going to say something. Nicole?
Yes, I agree with what Sister Doris has said, and I think that the work, and actually, as we're sitting here, I don't know if it's just because it's Advent and I start thinking about, our generations and the faith passed from generation to generation, but I feel a particular weight of responsibility as a youngster who is receiving the mantle of the work to receive the wisdom from those who've been doing it for so much longer than I have, and I think that what Francis is doing for us in this document, he's doing us a favor. He's saying that this kind of work is not ancillary to our faith as Catholics, even if it's if it's often been treated as such, and I think increasingly so in our times, but it's the heart of our faith, and that involves both issues among us and broader issues, and it shifts our gaze to see how those broader global issues do affect us within the church. I remember I wrote an essay, this was years ago now, for a volume on polarization in the Catholic Church, and the comments from the editors were, and I wrote my essay on racism and teaching about racism at a Catholic. At that time, I was at St. Anselm College in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I just wrote an essay about teaching students who are primarily white students about racism and white supremacy. And the editors pushed me. They said, "Tell us more about what this has to do with the life of the church." And I was like, well, it has everything to do with the life of the church. But, I tried to make it more explicit because, their point was that somebody reading this book, which wasn't written primarily, or I should say exclusively, for an academic audience, which is good. We need more of those books where those who are studying theology and can connect our faith to the call for dialogue or writing in a public way can say that, to the broader church. But I think that some of these issues that do seem at first blush to be, although those aren't, that's not contraception. Why would we get upset about that? Well, it affects, if it affects one part of the body, it affects us all. I had this, actually in college, I had a dear friend. She's still a dear friend, and we were both a part of the Catholic student organization, and we became very close, but we were from different neighborhoods of the church, and different political parties were, we were raised in different political parties and such. So we had a lot of differences, but in our friendship, we discussed a lot of those. And one issue that came up for us was, I said, I really wish women could be ordained in the church. And she said, that's never been an issue for me. And I said, well, if it's an issue for me, it's an issue for you, because we're part of the same body. And she said, oh, I never thought about it. And I said, reciprocally, things that might not seem important to me, but are important to you, that's my issue, as your sister in Christ, as one who shares this church. So I think what we're getting in the encyclical is a call back to that. It's nothing radical. It's not really anything, novel. This is who we are at our hearts. And if we want to be the church and the body of Christ for one another, then, we are called to act in this way.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why. I mean, I've been dealing for the last couple of years specifically with that intra-church polarization, which people are always saying. I mean, every year of my life they've said it's worse than it ever was before. I don't know if that's true, but it certainly seems like that. And I think one of the things that Pope Francis's papacy has done is put a lens on some of these issues, like race, like the environment, like the indigenous people, and how indigenous spirituality is looked at and treated, that a lot of Catholics never had to think about before, or never felt that they had to think about before. And I think it speaks to our broader society. I think dialogue is really the only way, but I think this polarization in some ways is the Band-Aid was ripped off, or we're going through a period of purification, where it's like, wait a minute, we have to look at every person. We have to look at what's important, what everybody's needs, priorities, desires, what hurts them, what makes them happy, what they want, what they need. I mean, some of these things maybe are misplaced or disordered or whatever, but I think it's that spirit of openness that the initiative, I think, wants to bring out, where we can have a safe space and, oh, this is something that's going on that's breaking your heart. This is something that's really troubled you for years, and the church's answer can't simply be, well, that's against church teaching, or that's against the rules, or that's, I mean, the church, we as a church, and I think what Francis is trying to say in Fratelli Tutti is we need to open up that listening. We need to have compassion for that hurt. We need to walk with, to use another Pope Francis, a synodal walk with others who are suffering or who have questions, or we can't be dismissive. And I think that's one of the, just listening to you guys and in my research about the initiative, I think it's a beautiful endeavor. And to come to the table knowing that maybe we aren't going to satisfy everyone's desires, but we're going to come together to express that we care about what you care about, or that we want to hear why you're troubled, or what stood out to you. I think that's, keep going, guys.
Well, thank you, Mike. And thank you for your work. So I extend on behalf of all of my colleagues in the Catholic Common Ground Initiative our gratitude to Sister Doris, to Nicole, to Mike, and a reflection in closing. I remember walking up to meeting a woman, and this is when I was with Cardinal Bernardine, and she said, "What do you do?" And I said, for Cardinal Bernardine, she said, "Oh, you know, he's my friend." And I'm like, I've been with him over 10 years at that point. I pretty well knew who his friends were. And so I was intrigued and I said, "Oh, really? Where do you know the Cardinal from?" And she said, "Oh, he confirmed my son. And we met him at the reception and we chatted a little while." It was one of the Cardinal's great gifts that any person he met, not any person, but in many ways in the personal encounter, he communicated, he was embracing, accepting, welcoming the other. And it was that spirit that he brought with Monsignor Murnian to the creation of the Catholic Common Ground initiative. And it's part of what always grounds me when I think of the Common Ground initiative is how do we create that sense by what we do that this other person is my friend. And Francis captures that in social friendship. And I think Common Ground is an expression of the belief we can build social friendship. In wrapping this up, who would have thought that in a papal document, dull, dreary papal documents, you would find an invitation to recover kindness? And on that note, let us take our leave, committing to recovering kindness, because if we do that, we'll be able to have dialogue.
Thank you.
So thank you all. Have a wonderful Advent season. To those who've been with us, thank you for joining the conversation. If you'd like to learn more about the Catholic Common Ground Initiative, go to our website, and also encourage you to see the website of the Bernardine Center. Take care. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.